Well, hey there, you're on the internet, I have some free time, and welcome to the Triple N Network, where all you newbie nib nerds can find all the news you'll need. Let's look at an ink today, shall we? Now, today's ink is by Noodler's, a sample I got from my wonderful, mysterious benefactor. Noodler's Cactus Fruit. And, this is pretty much exactly the kind of color that I personally don't enjoy. And I'm very sorry if that colors my opinion. I tried my utmost not to let that happen, but I am human and I hate this color. I'm sorry. So the pens that were used were these two Hero 616s. This one has sort of a standard unfilled with nib. It's quite fine. Very dry, for a fine nib. And this one was one that I altered, and as you can see, it's been ground to a much broader point, and it's been made a bit more wet. So, a bit of a range there. Thought I'd compare it to a few other inks. Now, here's Cactus Fruit up at the top, and here's Saguaro Wine, which actually the camera is making look just a smidge more different than it actually is. Cactus Fruit is just a touch darker, but yeah, very, shockingly similar. And I actually was given a bottle of Saguaro Wine, which is why I never tried a sample of Cactus Fruit, not just because I don't like these colors, but anyways. I thought I'd compare it to Black Swan and Australian Roses, and J.R. Bond's Rose Cyclamen. Rose Cyclamen, or whatever. Since I don't like this color, I don't have a lot of it, so this was sort of the best I could do, and I apologize. Let's check out the chromatography. Now here's how you're supposed to do chromatography, where you put a little dot of ink, dunk it in water, it gets pushed up. As you can see, it doesn't appear to be terribly water resistant, although, you can see where the drop initially was. Just pink and then sort of a bright pink and then into almost like a magenta. Here's where I let it dry, which is not how you're supposed to do it, but pretty much the only difference is the dot is just a tiny bit darker. So let's check out some paper tests, shall we? Top down to density, Clairefontaine, 90 grams per square meter. Let's see if I can hold this still. Yep. It's a very vibrant ink. It's a very bright magenta. As you can see, the fine nib took 3.5 seconds to dry. The broader, wetter one only took 7, which was pretty impressive for this fairly dense hydrophobic ink. As you can see, there's some shading. And even here there's some shading where it's not soppingly wet, because that is a quite wet nib. But yeah, very well behaved. No bleed, no feather, no spread, no echo. I would just call it ready flow, 5 out of 10 is like, I don't know, base minimum for like a good flow. 6 is like ready, like you put it to page and it just goes. I feel like a 5 is more like where you have to actually apply some pressure. Like, not a lot, but anyways, moving on. Water test, very messy. And it turns that bright pink, like we saw in here, which is a little weird. But honestly, I didn't expect this much water resistance, but I think it's because it seeped into the page, because it really, really did. As you can see, pretty much everything that was, affected by water came through the other side, which might explain why it dried so quickly. It seeped into the page. But yeah, next up, Rhodia, 80 grams per square meter. This was, if you've seen any of my other videos, I've noticed that sometimes the last, couple pages of a stack of paper, whether it's Clairefontaine or Rhodia or whatever, a lot of times it ends up acting a bit differently. And this was one of those. I could just sort of tell, because as you can see, there's no shading. It's just performed a bit oddly. And then there was this. It's bleed through on Rhodia. So sort of discounted that and used a much smaller piece of Rhodia. But this one acted much more the way you would expect. Here, the fine took 3.5 seconds to dry. The broad took 7, so essentially the same. Again, shading, very bright color. Water test, just it turned bright pink. A lot of it disappeared. But even here, I don't know, the light's kind of bright, so I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but it's, in a few spots, it looks like it almost wants to come through, kind of like it did on the Clairefontaine. But as you can see, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread. And it's such a light ink, there's no echo, so that's nice. No sheen either, seen so far. Speaking of sheen, next up is Tomoe River Paper, where, I don't know, usually like cream tends to like soften colors, but here it somehow seems even more like in your face, like really bright. But yeah, so Tomoe River, because of its water resistance, it does tend to extend dry time, so the fine nib is 6 seconds, the broader, wetter one is 11, which, if you know Tomoe River, is still kind of fast. So here you can see, I hope you can see that in the water test, there's a bit of a halo effect. So you do get shading, but there's no sheen. Usually that's where we would see some sheen, but we don't. But yeah, I mean, overall, very well behaved. As you would expect from Tomoe River, there's no bleed, no feather, no spread. There is some echo because this is very, very thin paper. I'll let the camera focus because it takes forever. But yeah, so if that's something you're sensitive to, something to be aware of, as you might be able to tell, the broader writing, of course, comes through a bit better than, or more clearly than the thinner writing. Tomoe River loves to let ink just slide away when you add water. But here you can still kind of read some of that. It's very bright pink. The camera is not lying in that regard. But there is a little bit left, so if you had to recover something, you probably could. Next up is the world's worst 20-pound copier paper, which, to be fair, I only use the fine nib. It's still pretty bright, you know, like it hasn't, sometimes the really absorbent papers sort of rob it of its vibrancy, but here it's still pretty bright. It took 1 second to dry, but this really is the world's worst copier paper. I'm going to try and hold this real still so you can get a look. Like, look at whir. You see all that woolliness? You see that feathering? It's pretty bad. Like, almost distractingly bad. Oh, yeah, not great. I mean, dried really quickly, but, I mean, there's bleed. There's feather, there's spread. Oh, the light's so bright you can't really see, but what you can see right now, pretty much everything, like all through that's all coming through, and extreme show through where it hasn't bled all the way through. Yeah, it's not great. The water test exploded, so even though absorbent paper sort of sucks the ink in and it gets harder to wash out, it can feather and explode like this, which can make it very difficult to read. Next is Mead Notebook Paper, where again, the ink is still fairly bright. It's still a very vibrant color. It took 1.5 seconds to dry, and here it did a bit better than the copier paper. It didn't spread quite as much. The line width didn't get as broad as it did. It didn't feather as much, and certainly didn't bleed as much, but this paper is actually thinner than the copier paper, so the show-through is a bit more intense. It did bleed through in some spots, I won't lie about that. It did come through. Okay, that's written with the broad nib. But yeah, here there's a couple of dots, but it's not terrible. And there's some woolliness that almost carries over to feathering. I mean, like, look at the S and spots, if my camera will focus. Do you see what I mean about woolliness? Like, and? See where it says, like, does that count as feathers, or is that... But yeah, so... Again, the water test was kind of explodey, got very bright pink, sort of dyed the page a bit. Not ideal, but we've seen much, much worse. And last is Moleskine Notebook Paper, where it imploded on itself. Let's look at Cactus Fruit. Let's look at the word. Try and hold that real still so you can see all those crazy feathers. And that was written with the broad nib, but then if you look down at standard fine, if the light will catch it, there are lots of little feathers there too, and they're all throughout. Like, look at Wizards. Oh, 5. That's, I mean, that's just how it is. And it took 5 seconds to dry, which was a little weird because this is more absorbent paper. So, I mean, it took longer to dry here than it did on the Clairefontaine, which I can't explain, but there you are. Yeah, so, I mean, there's, but yeah, there was only bleed in the you know, scribbly, but, yeah, I mean, it's a fine nib. Oh, no, that's a broad nib, never mind, ignore that. But, yeah, it's, there was spread, you know, the line got broader, there was a lot of feathering. It's still fairly vibrant, but I don't know, even here it seems slightly more muted, but yeah, the water test, the feathers just absolutely exploded off that. It turned bright pink. It didn't dye the page, but it definitely got harder to read, and it came through. So there you go. There's Noodler's Cactus Fruit. It is eye-poppingly magenta. It's a bit darker than Saguaro Wine. So if you have Saguaro Wine or you like Saguaro Wine and you wanted something just a touch darker, this is a good option. It's a bit wet, pretty well behaved on nice papers, doesn't sheen. I hate it, but lots of people love this color, so have at it, y'all. If you like the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe to the channel. And thanks for watching. Bye.